Welcome back to every Nintendo 64 RPG ever. The last episode was on Aidyn Chronicles the First Mage, and it was easily one of the worst games I've ever played. Luckily, the subject of this video, Quest 64, is actually not that bad of a game, nor is it a chore to play, despite what I've been told countless times. I'm not a fan of unjust contrarianism, but I've only ever heard negative things of Quest 64, and I think there's quite a bit of value contained within. That's not to say it's a standout title, or even that it's a good game, but having heard repeatedly how awful it is, I was pleasantly surprised when I loaded the fucker and it was just okay. Unlike the PS1 RPGs of the time, most Nintendo 64 cartridges lacked the space for FMVs, so they generally opted to have in-engine events which I'd struggle to call cutscenes. Quest 64 dialed it back even further and simply dropped some models on a map and slapped some dialogue boxes over the top. As much as this seemed like a cheap out, and it may well be, when you look at how certain other titles handled in-engine cutscenes, I think I'd prefer the cheap text box solution, to be perfectly honest. This element of minimalism fits what Quest 64 clearly set out to be, as the narrative is anything but complex and a majority of the mechanics are so simplified you'd swear it was made on a baby console for babies. Also, if you look at early development screenshots, you can see that the team were originally going for a less cutesy look, but ultimately settled on these smaller character models and brighter, more colourful textures. Whether this was a constraints issue, a stylistic choice, or a demographic grab, it worked to its benefit, and I'd say we're better off having known Quest 64 in this form. Anyway, during one of these overly simplistic exposition dumps, we're told of 4 gems and a book that we have to get, and that our father buggered off to find them, but he went missing or something. After this, we're given control of the player, and we're off on our journey. I always find it refreshing when an RPG actually begins within the first hour, even if the journey seems unimportant and the goals are so vague that you end up running around aimlessly throughout most of it. Quest 64 doesn't suffer from this too badly, as in any of the 6 overworld maps, there are only 2 or 3 major points of interest, and they're all connected via narrow linear paths. The game is so bare bones that it indirectly guides you to the next plot point simply because there's nowhere else to go. In addition to that, with a small amount of map interconnectivity and a never-ending supply of items which warp you to specific towns, the destination is rarely a guessing game. It certainly doesn't make up for the absence of a strong narrative, or fuck, any narrative at all, but it helps. I also noticed that the random encounter rate was much less of an issue in these overworld hubs, and that enemies seemed to appear less frequently. I'm not sure if this was actually the case, or if I simply preferred the hubs to the dungeons, so it seemed like it was less of a problem. The quote-unquote dungeons themselves aren't so much dungeons as they are caves and forests, and while I love a good forest level, these left something to be desired. With a heavy reuse of samey assets and textures to the point where some maps actually featured signposts directing the player, it all felt like a bit of a chore. The developers noticed this and refused to change it, and I'm confident in my assessment not only due to the signposts, but also because of how the post-battle camera works. Since the combat takes place on the same plane as general traversal, it's easy to lead into a battle facing one direction and close the battle facing an entirely different direction. You are granted a compass, but remembering which direction you are facing pre-battle is not high up on the list of priorities. As the environments in these areas are often indistinguishable, there's a function which activates at the end of every encounter, which shifts the camera and the character model back to their pre-battle position. The camera follows the model in a fairly strict manner, and manual player control takes priority over the post-battle correction, so if you don't figure it out, dungeons can quickly go from a bland stroll to an infuriating game of guess where the fuck you are now? It wouldn't be a huge issue if the random encounter rate were less frequent, but the post-battle correction is a decent way of slapping a bandage over a missing limb, in that it won't kill you, but you'll wish you were dead. It baffles me as to how the caves and forests are so unintuitive and forgettable, yet the overworld and towns are so vibrant and distinct. Towns are typically smaller hubs with no more than 10 houses and only a handful of NPCs, yet each feels populated and memorable. I'd say this is due to the fact that Quest 64 stands out with its use of simple shapes for models, bright cartoony colours, and textures which look crisp from even a short distance away. Since there's no currency, no equipment, and items are handed out according to your needs, there's little point to towns existing. There are inns which allow you to save and heal, but if you have a healing spell, they're pretty much redundant with the way stats increase and how MP restores itself when you walk, allowing you to spam heal pretty much anywhere. There are 4 stats in the game: HP, MP, defense, and agility. They're all fairly self-explanatory, but what's interesting about them is how they increase. Health increases by taking damage and performing physical attacks. Magic increases by casting spells. Defense is bumped by, again, taking damage. And agility goes up the more you walk in battle and dodge enemy attacks. It's a neat system, quite reminiscent of Final Fantasy II, one of my personal faves, and I'd be fine with it existing in this form if it weren't for the crippling length of the game. My playthrough was only about 8 hours, and in that time I reckon a good 6 of that took place in combat, but towards the end of the game my stats were so low that I had to cheese boss fights to avoid grinding. Since I've mentioned cheese, I'd best talk about elemental distribution. Upon leveling up, you're prompted to increase a particular elemental tree, and you can slot 1 point into either fire, water, earth, or wind. Once you have enough points in any tree, you'll unlock spells, some of which are useful, some of which are the complete opposite, and some break the game entirely. I started by putting points into fire, as I figured it was the safest tree, but about 10 levels in, I found that it wasn't doing much damage, and my physical attack was much stronger. While the fire path does grant you some useful buffs and decent attacks at higher levels, it has nothing on the earth path. I put another 10 levels into earth and found that it was doing significantly higher damage, and it had spells with a sizable area of effect, so I focused primarily on that instead. There came a time when I needed healing, and items were simply not cutting it, so I put some points into the water path hoping for a healing spell and became unstoppable. I mean, fuck, the earth path alone has 2 spells which completely break the game, one negating all magic damage and the other doing multiple hits of incredibly high damage. Couple that with the accessibility and low cost of the healing spells, and I'd completely broken the game. It's not even a particularly hard experience, and there's no penalties for dying, but there is a slight grind demanded in the last couple of stages, and I simply opted to cheese it. It is possible to access these broken spells very early on, as alongside level ups increasing your elemental distribution tree, there's also spirits. Spirits are these light-coloured bubbles strewn throughout the world, which act as a reward for exploration, and collecting as many of these as possible is essential for a smooth experience. It also seems that they exist in an attempt to curve the difficulty spikes, as the game is extremely short and very few people enjoy grinding. The spirits themselves have an insane draw distance and load in before you can even see the boundaries of the maps, which I think is fantastic. They function like the red coins of Mario 64, where they're an item of importance and thus get high priority when being displayed. I prefer having the large draw distance where you can easily spot them from across a gigantic map, as opposed to a smaller draw distance where you'd have to manually seek them out. Having a tiny little objective marker sitting across a vast expanse can prompt a journey, and it gives you a direct incentive to venture forth in that direction, as opposed to wandering blindly in hopes of justification. Where I'd say this was a missed opportunity is that the game is pretty much empty. It would have been impressive to have landmarks or events occur between the point a player enters a map and where the spirits were placed, effectively using them as a means to guide the player to sub-stories without directly spelling it out. Along some of your lengthy expeditions to get these spirits, you'll get to enjoy the soundtrack, which went a really long way in making the game not feel like Aidyn Chronicles. Since the game's short, you never have an opportunity to get sick of any particular track, except maybe the battle theme. It's a decent tune, but you'll be in combat so often that you become numb to it, which aptly describes battles as well. The combat is about as non-intrusive for a JRPG as it can possibly be, and it takes place on the same maps in which you walk around. The encounters trigger at random, and when they begin, enemies pop up in front of you, as well as this electrified-looking barrier. Combat takes place within this confine in a turn-for-turn style. It doesn't matter how many enemies you're up against or how high any of your stats are, ending your turn will always hand control over to the enemy, and vice versa. This can make it really easy to exploit tougher battles with multiple enemies by keeping the weaker ones alive, as it means the stronger ones now need to divide their turns between the living. During your turn, you can freely move your character around, attack the enemy, pass your turn, or flee. As you move, you're given your own little electrified looking barrier, which is your move radius, and any enemy inside that is open to a physical attack. Enemies outside of it can be targeted with magic, and that's about as complex as the combat gets. No random battle should give you too much of a problem. As I mentioned previously, MP regenerates when you're moving around the field, so you'll generally have a full MP pool to blast your strongest magic at the weakest foes. The battles also move at lightning speed, which was a nice offset to the occasionally bullshit encounter rate. While it is an extremely simple system, there is actually benefit to a large concentration of battles outside of just raising your stats, and that is spell mastery. Casting a spell isn't a guaranteed hit, as whenever you cast, you have to take into account the spell arc, the target, and the area of effect. For single target spells, simply rotating in the direction of an enemy changes the active recipient, and I couldn't see a proper method of selecting who to attack, which is a bit of an oversight, but a system I still had a lot of fun with. Testing all sorts of positions to see the distance or arc of spells was enough to keep most of the random encounters feeling like an experiment. You're constantly obtaining new spells and are given new enemy formations to try them on, and it often feels like more of an exploratory puzzle than just another random encounter. This is the reason I wasn't a fan of the boss fights, as they scrapped that sense of discovery. They all consisted of one strong unit who can absolutely wreck your shit if you're not extremely careful. The only time the difficulty ramped up was when you encountered one of these fights, and it's very hard not to lose to them, which is why I opted to cheese them with Magic Shield. Look, say what you will about an unbalanced RPG, but I'm not grinding against a bunch of weak enemies so I can beat poorly balanced bosses, alright? And to be fair, some bosses are okay, but most throw you over a difficulty cliff, and with how simplistic combat is, you either spam attacks and then heal, or spam attacks from behind the magic shield. Also, fuck the battle camera. To conclude, Quest 64 isn't a terrible game, and there's actually some interesting shit they've done to keep it from being a pain in the ass to the best of their ability. It's quick, it's snappy, there's minimal bloat, and while it's lacking any sort of meaningful depth, it would have worked as a fantastic skeleton for a sequel, which was actually being teased at one point. I still wouldn't recommend it as anything close to a must-play, but the internet gave me a set of expectations that it far surpassed, in a positive way. I wouldn't call it a good game, but it's perfectly functional, and it's just okay, which I think's fine. The general positive review could simply be me comparing it to Aidyn Chronicles, which was infinitely worse in every way. So if this review seems skewed, watch my previous video to find out why.
On the next episode of every Nintendo 64 RPG ever, I'll be doing Ogre Battle and